Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. She thought this year would be different. After 72 years of careful living and quiet giving, Margaret Collins finally heard the words she had longed for. "We want you here for Thanksgiving." She packed her gifts, her savings, and even a new navy cardigan, imagining herself at the family table at last. But when the plane landed and the families embraced around her, she stood alone with her suitcase. Then came the photo on her phone, her son and his family smiling wide under the caption, "Full House, Full Hearts." She was not in it. That empty space cut deeper than words ever could, and it was in that silence Margaret chose a different kind of revenge. I was rinsing out my coffee cup when the phone rang. At first, I thought it was just another robocall, the kind that seems to multiply once you turn 70, but when I glanced at the caller ID, my chest gave a little jolt. It was David. My son hardly ever called unless there was a birthday or a bill he wanted to discuss, so seeing his name pop up on a gray November morning felt unusual. I dried my hands quickly and picked up before the machine could get it. His voice came bright and cheerful, almost rehearsed. "Hi, Mom! What are you doing for Thanksgiving this year?" I hesitated, feeling the familiar ache of holidays spent alone. I told him I planned to stay here in Hartford, roast a small chicken, maybe bake a pie if my hands allowed it, and watch an old movie. Nothing fancy, I said, just me and the radio. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough for me to picture him calculating something. Then he said it. "The kids have been asking about you. We thought maybe you could come here this year. Chicago would love to see you. Everyone will be together. It just would not feel right without you." Those words, "it would not feel right without you," struck deeper than he knew. It had been a long time since I felt truly wanted anywhere, not just needed for babysitting or asked for money, but wanted. I leaned against the counter, my heart beating faster than it should for such a simple invitation. "Are you sure?" I asked, not wanting to sound desperate, but needing to hear it again. "Of course," he said warmly, "we want you here." I felt something loosen inside me, something that had been wound tight for years. "All right," I said softly. "I will look at flights tonight." He did not offer to help book the ticket, and I did not ask. After we hung up, I stood there with the receiver still in my hand, staring at the worn linoleum floor as if it might answer why I suddenly felt lighter. I had an envelope tucked away in my desk drawer, money I had saved from last Christmas when I skipped buying myself a winter coat. It was supposed to be for emergencies. I decided this qualified. That evening, I pulled out the old laptop and searched. My fingers trembled a little on the keys, the glow of the screen reflecting off the small framed photo of David on my bookshelf, taken when he was 12, grinning with a chipped front tooth. I found a non-stop flight early afternoon, a decent fare if I booked right away. My heart thumped when I clicked purchase. I even paid the extra fee for a seat with more legroom. Silly maybe, but if I was going to travel halfway across the country, I might as well do it comfortably. The next day, I went into town. The air was sharp, the kind that makes your cheeks sting, and the sidewalks were already slick with fallen leaves. I stopped at the bookstore and picked out 2 paperbacks for Lily and Ethan. I could picture Lily's face lighting up at the mystery novel and Ethan curling up with the science book about planets. At the candy shop on Main Street, I bought a box of dark chocolate truffles that I remembered Samantha always liked. I carried the small bags back to the car, humming softly to myself. At the department store, I tried on cardigans. My hands lingered over the soft navy wool, the kind that draped just right at the hips. I thought about how it might look in a family photo, how it might make me feel like I belonged in the picture too. I bought it and tucked it carefully into the bag with the books and candy. Back home, I laid everything out on the bed. The books, the chocolates, the cardigan, and the old pie dish that had traveled through decades of Thanksgivings. I ran my fingers over its worn edges and thought of the pies I had baked for David when he was young. Apple pumpkin pecan pies cooling on the windowsill while he came in from playing football in the yard. Those memories came rushing back, warm and heavy. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine setting a pie down on his table again, surrounded by family. That night, as I folded laundry, I kept replaying the call in my head. His voice had sounded so eager, so different from the distracted tone I had grown used to. Could it be that he truly wanted me there, not as an afterthought, not because it was convenient, but because I mattered? I brushed the thought aside, afraid to hope too much, but it still lingered like the faint scent of cinnamon from the candle burning on my counter. I packed early 3 days before the flight. I ironed my good skirt, polished the black shoes with the tiny heel, and set aside my warm coat. I checked the weather in Chicago colder than here, and smiled at the idea of bundling up while walking with my grandchildren. The suitcase sat in the corner of the bedroom like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. That evening, while sipping tea, I looked out the window at the quiet street. The Collins house, silent except for the tick of the clock, felt different somehow. Less like a waiting room, more like a launching pad. I whispered to myself without meaning to, maybe this year will be different. When I slid under the covers, the navy cardigan folded neatly on the chair, the pie dish wrapped in a towel inside my suitcase, I closed my eyes and let myself believe it. For once, I thought maybe I was not just the person who filled in the gaps. Maybe, just maybe, I was finally being asked to take a real seat at the table. And as sleep pulled me under, I held on to that fragile but glowing thought. Perhaps at last I was truly needed. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, the November light just beginning to seep through the blinds. I made coffee and stood in the kitchen looking at the suitcase I had left open on the chair. It felt strange to be preparing for something that was not a doctor's appointment or a funeral. This time, I was packing for a holiday, for a gathering where I was expected, at least that is what I told myself. I pulled the navy cardigan from its bag and held it up against me in the mirror. The color was deep and calming, the wool soft against my skin. I folded it carefully and placed it in the suitcase, smoothing it down as if I were tucking a child into bed. Beside it, I wrapped the old pie dish in a towel so it would not crack in transit. That dish had seen decades of Thanksgivings, and the thought of bringing it into David's kitchen made me smile. After breakfast, I drove into town again. The air was crisp and carried the faint smell of wood smoke. At the corner bakery, I bought 2 loaves of sourdough, thinking Lily and Ethan might like them with butter in the mornings. At the gift shop, I found a puzzle with 1,000 pieces, a winter scene, that I imagined we could all work on together after dinner. I caught myself grinning at the thought of sitting shoulder to shoulder with them, trying to match tiny blue sky pieces. When I returned home, I spread everything across the bed. The books for the kids, the chocolates for Samantha, the cardigan, the pie dish, the bread, and the puzzle. It looked like a collection of promises. I began packing them into the suitcase 3 days ahead of my flight folding and arranging as if careful placement could secure the future I wanted. That afternoon, while I was humming along to an old song on the radio, there was a knock at the door. I wiped my hands and opened it to see Frank Dawson from next door. He leaned on the railing with the casual air of a man who had lived on the block his entire life. He noticed the suitcase behind me and raised an eyebrow. "Heading somewhere, Margaret?" he asked. I nodded, unable to hide the smile on my face. Going to Chicago for Thanksgiving. David invited me. Frank gave a low whistle and then studied me with eyes that had seen more than they ever said. That sounds nice, he finally offered, though his voice carried a note of caution. Just don't set your expectations too high. For a moment my smile faltered, but I straightened and replied more firmly than I felt. It will be different this time. I know it. He shrugged, adjusting his cap, and gave a small wave as he walked back to his yard. I closed the door and leaned against it, his words echoing in my head. But I refused to let them take root. I turned the radio up louder and began polishing my shoes. The black ones with the tiny heel had carried me through church services, weddings, and more than a few lonely Thanksgivings. I wanted them to shine when I stepped off the plane. I wanted to look like a woman worth waiting for. That night, I laid in bed with the suitcase open beside me, the navy cardigan folded neatly on top. I imagined David smiling as he saw me walk through arrivals. Samantha perhaps surprised, but welcoming the children running into my arms. I closed my eyes and held that picture tight. The next 2 days passed in a blur of small preparations. I washed my best blouse and ironed it until it was crisp. I called the heating company to set the thermostat low while I was away. I even took out the trash early so I would not come back to any smell in the kitchen. Each task carried a strange joy, as if I were sweeping away the dust of years of solitude in exchange for something bright. The night before my flight, I double-checked my ticket, placed my ID and boarding pass in my purse, and set the alarm for dawn. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, staring at the suitcase by the door. The cardigan, the pie dish, the puzzle, the gifts. They were more than things. They were proof of hope. I whispered into the quiet room, almost as if confessing to myself it will be different. And with that I turned out the light, ready to meet the morning. The plane touched down in Chicago just as the afternoon sun broke through a bank of gray clouds. I smoothed the wrinkles from my skirt and clutched my purse, my pulse quickening as passengers around me gathered their bags and hurried toward the aisle. The hum of excitement in the cabin seemed to lift me along, and for a moment I felt like I was part of something grand, a holiday homecoming. Inside the terminal, the air smelled of coffee and jet fuel, and the voices of countless reunions filled the space. I pulled my suitcase behind me toward the arrivals gate, my heart pounding with each step. Crowds pressed forward, craning their necks, holding flowers and balloons, little children bouncing on their toes with handmade signs. Everywhere I looked, people were rushing into arms that had waited for them. A man in a Cubs hat hugged his daughter so tight she squealed. An older woman wiped tears from her cheeks as her grandchildren clung to her legs. Laughter, kisses, voices, calling out names filled the air like music. And then there was me. I stood near the center with my suitcase parked neatly beside me, my coat folded over my arm. I checked the monitor again, confirming that my flight had landed on time. Any minute now, I told myself, David and Samantha and the kids would come weaving through the crowd, smiling, waving, calling out my name. I straightened my back, brushed invisible lint from my cardigan, and tried to look like the kind of woman who was expected. Minutes slipped by, 10, 15, then 20. Families who had waited with me disappeared into elevators and escalators, leaving the space emptier, quieter. My smile began to ache, and I shifted from one foot to the other. I told myself not to worry. Maybe traffic had slowed them. Maybe Samantha had stopped to fix her makeup, or Lily and Ethan were dragging their feet. These things happened. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. No missed calls, no new messages. I pressed David's number and lifted it to my ear, straining to hear his familiar voice over the noise of the terminal. It rang until voicemail picked up. I hung up quickly, cheeks flushing as if strangers could see the rejection. I tried again a few minutes later, but it went to voicemail once more. I cleared my throat and left a message, keeping my voice bright. "Hi, it's Mom. I just landed. I am at the arrivals area waiting near the sign with the airplane symbol. Hope everything is okay. I will wait here." I ended the call and tucked the phone back into my bag, telling myself he would call any minute. Another wave of passengers surged past, greeted by cheers and embraces, and I felt the weight of my solitude press harder. I shifted my suitcase closer, suddenly aware of how small I must have looked among all that joy. My chest tightened with the sting of being left behind. I pulled my phone out again, thinking maybe I had missed a message. There were no texts, no voicemails, just a soft buzz of notifications from social media. Out of habit, I opened the app, not because I cared about those things, but because sometimes my family posted photos there before remembering to tell me directly. The picture loaded slowly, the screen glowing in my hand, and then I saw it. David in the navy sweater I had sent him last year, standing at the head of a long table. Samantha beside him, smiling wide and perfect. Lily and Ethan pressed close, their cheeks pink in the candlelight. The table was covered with a golden turkey bowls of potatoes, cranberry sauce, and a pie that was not mine. Glasses lifted high in a toast, everyone's faces glowing warm. Beneath the photo was the caption, "Full house, full hearts. Happy Thanksgiving from our family to yours." My breath caught in my throat. I zoomed in, scanning the frames, searching for any empty space that might have been meant for me. There was none. Every chair was filled, every plate served. The family was complete, and I was not there. The clamor of the terminal faded, replaced by the pounding of blood in my ears. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. My suitcase stood obedient at my side, my coat draped neatly over my arm, and I realized I looked exactly like what I was. A package that had been misplaced, waiting for someone who had no intention of coming. I did not cry. Not then. I simply locked the phone, slid it back into my purse, and wrapped my coat tighter around me. My feet began to move almost of their own accord, carrying me away from the arrivals gate, away from the laughter and the flowers and the balloons. Each step echoed with a hollow truth that cut deeper than any sharp word ever could. I walked past the taxi line, past the shuttle buses idling at the curb, past families still gathered in happy circles. The November air outside was colder than I expected, a sharp wind slicing through the folds of my coat. I gripped the handle of my suitcase tighter, the wheels rattling against the pavement, and kept walking because there was nothing else to do. And in my chest, where anticipation had lived for days, something cracked and fell silent. I pushed through the automatic doors into the sharp Chicago air, my suitcase bumping against my heels with every step. The wind bit at my cheeks and slid down the back of my collar, and for the first time all day, the weight of my coat felt thin. I tightened it around me, my hand stiff on the handle of the suitcase. My breath came out in small clouds that vanished quickly in the gray light. The sidewalk outside the terminal was crowded with cars pulling in and out, families hurrying to load bags into trunks, taxi drivers waving signs at confused passengers. I moved slowly, careful not to trip over the uneven pavement. I had no plan, nowhere to go, only the gnawing need to keep walking away from the place where everyone else was claimed. As I passed the pickup zone, a small commotion caught my eye. A woman older than me stepped through the doors, her thin frame trembling slightly in the cold. Waiting for her stood a group of relatives holding a bouquet of flowers and a homemade sign that said, "Welcome, Grandma." Their voices rose in delight as they rushed forward, wrapping her in hugs, pressing kisses against her face. She laughed, her eyes wet, clutching the flowers like they were proof of something sacred. I slowed my pace, the sight hitting me harder than the wind. I had imagined that exact moment for myself, David lifting a hand to wave Lily and Ethan running to me with open arms. Instead, I stood at a distance, an observer of another woman's joy, my chest hollowing out as though someone had scooped the air from me. I turned my head away quickly and gripped the handle of my suitcase until my knuckles ached. The curbs stretched on, busy with buses and shuttles. I walked past the neon signs for rental cars, past the long line of taxis. My legs ached, but I kept moving as if forward motion itself might keep me from collapsing. After a few blocks, the noise of the airport faded, replaced by the low hum of the traffic on the highway. My stomach growled, reminding me that I had not eaten since early morning. That was when I saw the glow of a neon sign ahead. Tina's Diner flickered in orange letters above a squat brick building with fogged windows. Paper turkeys were taped unevenly to the glass, their colors faded but cheerful. The warmth spilling through the doorway was enough to pull me in. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The smell of fried potatoes and cinnamon hit me thick and comforting. Vinyl booths lined the walls, the seats cracked and patched with tape. A couple sat silently at one table. A man in a UPS jacket sipped coffee at another, and behind the counter a young waitress with a short ponytail looked up. Her smile was quick and genuine. "Happy Thanksgiving, hon," she said as if I were expected. The sound of those words wrapped around me in a way I did not anticipate. "Same to you," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. I slid into a booth near the window, setting my suitcase beside me like a loyal dog. The warmth of the seat seeped through my skirt, easing the chill in my bones. The waitress brought me a laminated menu, its corners frayed, and said the kitchen was a little slow, but they had turkey plates and plenty of pie. My mouth felt dry. "Pie sounds good," I answered. "What kind?" she asked, her pen poised. "Pumpkin, pecan, or key lime?" I thought for a moment and then said, "Pumpkin with tea if you have it." She grinned. "You got it." I leaned back against the booth and looked out the window. The neon sign buzzed faintly, the letters flickering in and out. My suitcase stood upright beside me, silent, patient, as if waiting for instructions. My phone lay on the table face down, vibrating once, with another message I did not flip over to read. When the pie arrived, steam curled from its golden surface. A dollop of whipped cream sat lopsided on top, already melting into the crust. The waitress set down the tea as well, its dark surface quivering. I picked up the fork with trembling hands, cut into the pie, and lifted the first bite to my mouth. The sweetness hit my tongue, the cinnamon sharp against the pumpkin, the crust buttery and soft. I closed my eyes as I chewed, and a strange realization washed over me. This was the first slice of pie I had eaten in years that I had not baked for someone else. I had not stayed up late mixing the filling, not worried over the oven temperature, not carried it carefully across town to place on someone else's table. This pie was mine. I swallowed my throat thick and took another bite slowly. The noise of the diner faded into the background. For once, I was not serving, not waiting, not hoping for gratitude. I was simply eating, feeding myself, existing on my own terms. The flavor was both bitter and liberating. I lifted the cup of tea to my lips, the steam warming my face, and for the first time that day, my hands stopped trembling. The pie sat before me, the tea strong and slightly bitter, and I felt something unfamiliar settle inside. Not peace, not yet, but a fragile clarity, as if I had stepped out of a shadow I had not realized I was living in. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, letting the warmth spread through me. Outside the window, the sky deepened into evening and the neon letters of Tina's diner glowed against the dark. My suitcase waited at my side, my phone silent on the table, and for that moment I did not care who had forgotten me. I was still here. I had just set my purse down on the kitchen table when the phone rang, its vibration rattling against the wood like it had something urgent to say. The screen lit with David's name. For a moment I thought of letting it go dark, but some part of me needed to hear what excuse he would make. I pressed accept. Mom David's voice came through softer than usual, almost careful. Olivia said you looked upset on Sunday. You know we still love you, right? But you have to understand things are really stressful for us. Sometimes you take things too personally. I let the silence stretch for several seconds. He filled it with the sound of his own breath. My chest tightened, but when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, steady. Love that comes with excuses is not love. David. He sighed heavy and theatrical, as if I were the difficult one. I just wish you wouldn't make Olivia feel guilty. She's trying. We're all trying. My hand rested on the worn wood of the table, the same table where David once did his homework with his legs swinging off the chair. I thought of the checks I had written over the years. The savings accounts drained the retirement fund, dwindling the insurance money Frank had left me. I gave you my savings, my retirement, even your father's insurance. I said, my tone level, but sharper than I intended. I don't need guilt on top of that. There was a pause. I imagined him pinching the bridge of his nose the way he used to when work stressed him, rehearsing the right words to keep me pliant. Mom, please don't make this harder than it is. I closed my eyes and breathed in slowly, feeling a weight shift inside me. Love without respect is not love. I said clearly, each word like a stone placed firmly in its spot. I have given enough. This ends now. The line crackled with his silence. I did not wait for an answer. I pressed end, set the phone face down on the table, and listened to the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet house. I drove back to Hartford 2 days later, the miles stretching out across the highway in a blur of gray pavement and bare trees. The suitcase sat silent in the trunk, the cardigan and gifts still folded neatly inside, untouched. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the house looked smaller than ever, its shutters rattling in the wind, the lawn scattered with brittle leaves. I parked, turned off the ignition, and sat in the silence for a long moment before forcing myself to get out. Inside, the familiar smell of dust and old books met me. I set my purse on the counter and stood in the middle of the living room, unsure of what to do with myself. The phone had finally gone quiet after I stopped answering it. No more buzzing, no more pleading messages. Just silence. My eyes drifted to the cabinet in the hallway, the one with the folders and envelopes I had been keeping for years. A thought pressed at me, unwelcome but insistent. I walked over, opened the drawer, and began pulling everything out. Stacks of bank statements, receipts from repair shops, hospital bills, tuition payments, all carefully kept in manila folders. I spread them across the dining table, the paper rustling like dry leaves. At first, I only meant to glance through them, but soon I was combing line by line, tallying numbers in my head. There was the check from 2010 when David's car broke down, $3,000 I wired so he could get to work. In 2012, $5,000 for the down payment on their house. Another $6,000 in 2014 for Lily's private school tuition. It went on and on, year after year, thousands here, thousands there. I flipped through them faster, my breath tightening as the totals mounted. $7,000 for Ethan's summer camp, $4,000 to cover a credit card bill. Samantha said was an emergency $10,000 when David lost his job for 6 months. I had forgotten how many times I had pulled them back from the brink. I had done it quietly, willingly telling myself that was what family did. By the time I reached the last folder from 2022, my rough calculations had passed $120,000. I sank into the chair, staring at the mountain of paper. My hands trembled as I pressed them flat against the table. The numbers stared back undeniable. I had given and given until there was nothing left but the walls around me and the fading photograph of a boy with a chipped tooth. Something slipped out of one of the folders, a folded document I did not recognize right away. I opened it and felt the air leave my lungs. It was the power of attorney form from 2015. My own signature at the bottom, shaky but mine, giving David authority over my finances if I ever became incapacitated. I remembered signing it after my hip surgery when he told me it was just a precaution, just in case. I had trusted him. I had believed. I traced the lines of the paper with my finger, the words blurring as tears finally welled up. It was more than being left at an airport, more than being excluded from a photograph. It was a betrayal that reached into my bank account, into the very core of my trust. He had positioned himself to control what little I had left, and I had let him. The room seemed to tilt around me. I pressed the document flat on the table, staring at it until the ink seemed to sear into my vision. It was not only my heart that had been dismissed, but my worth, my sacrifices, my security. He had reduced me to a resource, nothing more. I sat there long into the evening, the light fading outside the papers scattered around me like fallen leaves no one had bothered to rake. The numbers whispered in my head, the total rising higher and higher until it became unbearable. I could hear David's voice in every page asking, promising to pay back, assuring me it was temporary. Yet nothing had ever come back to me. My body felt heavy, my shoulders slumped as I leaned back in the chair. For years, I had convinced myself that the small exclusions were oversights, that the requests for money were out of need, not entitlement. But the truth stared back at me in black and white. It had never been an accident. It had been a pattern. A slow erosion of who I was until all that remained was a chair in the corner and a bank account to draw from. I gathered the papers into a pile, my fingers stiff. The power of attorney form lay on top, its edges sharp against my skin. I slipped it into a separate folder and placed it on the counter where I could not ignore it. I knew what it meant now. I knew what I had allowed. The clock ticked on the wall loud in the silence. I rose slowly, turned off the lamp and walked toward the bedroom. The house felt different, smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were closing in with the weight of truth. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded in my lap, staring into the darkness. The betrayal was no longer a vague ache. It was a fact measured in dollars and signed in ink. And as I lay down, pulling the blanket over me, I understood that something inside me had shifted. The line had been crossed twice, and there would be no going back. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness that settled deeper than fatigue. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the folder with the power of attorney papers inside. The numbers from the night before echoed in my head, each dollar, a reminder of how far I had let myself be taken for granted. My hand shook slightly as I lifted the folder and slipped it into my purse. It was time to draw a line. By mid-morning, I was sitting in the parking lot of Hartford Mutual Bank, the engine ticking as it cooled. The building stood squat and gray, the windows gleaming in the weak sunlight. I took a deep breath, smoothed the front of my cardigan, and stepped out of the car. The cold air bit at my cheeks, but my chest carried a heat that steadied me. Inside, the familiar scent of polished wood and toner filled the lobby. I had been coming here for years, usually to deposit checks or withdraw a small amount of cash. Today felt different, heavier, final. The teller recognized me and offered a polite smile before directing me to the office of the branch manager, Chloe Sanders. Chloe rose from behind her desk as I entered, her blonde hair, neat, her suit pressed. She was in her early 40s, brisk but not unkind, the kind of woman who always seemed one step ahead. "Good morning, Mrs. Collins," she said. "What can I help you with today?" I sat down carefully, my purse heavy at my side. "I would like to make some changes to my accounts." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she nodded, pulling a folder toward her. "Certainly. What changes are you looking to make?" My voice felt steadier than I expected. "I want to stop all recurring transfers to my son, David Collins. Effective immediately." Her pen paused above the paper. "And I want to revoke the power of attorney that grants him access to my accounts." For the first time, she looked directly at me, her eyes narrowing with professional concern. "Mrs. Collins, may I ask if something happened? These are significant changes. Most people like to give me a reason." The silence stretched between us, the hum of the air conditioner filling the space. I thought of David's voice, cheerful on the phone, when he invited me, the caption beneath that photo, "The years of checks signed without hesitation." My lips curved into the faintest smile, one that tasted bitter and clean at the same time. "I have explained enough over the years," I said softly. "That is all you need to know." Chloe studied me for a moment longer, perhaps weighing whether to push, then nodded briskly. "Very well." She began typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard. I watched as forms were pulled up, boxes checked, authorizations printed. My signature scrawled across line after line, each stroke of the pen cutting away another thread that had bound me. When she finally looked up, her tone was neutral, but her eyes had softened. "The transfers are canceled. The power of attorney is revoked. Only you will have access moving forward." "Thank you," I said, rising slowly. She handed me a copy of the documents, crisp and final. I slipped them into my purse, their weight grounding me. As I stepped back into the lobby, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The chatter of customers, the clicking of keyboards, the shuffle of papers all faded into the background. For the first time in years, my money, my choices, my future were mine again. Outside, the sky had darkened, clouds gathering low and heavy. I walked across the lot with my head high, the folder pressing against my side with every step. The wind whipped at my coat, but I welcomed its sting. Each gust carried away the last traces of hesitation. I climbed into my car, shut the door, and let out a long breath I had not realized I was holding. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked older, yes, but also sharper, more defined. I gripped the steering wheel and sat in the quiet, the sound of rain beginning to patter against the windshield. It struck me then that revenge did not always require shouting or grand gestures. Sometimes it was as simple as silence, as simple as turning off the faucet that others had drunk from without gratitude. I turned the key, the engine rumbling to life, and pulled out onto the road. The rain picked up, streaking the glass, blurring the familiar streets of Hartford. My hands were steady on the wheel. The first step had been taken, and there was no turning back. The knock on the door came just after dusk, sharp and deliberate. When I opened it, Olivia stood there with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Margaret," she said brightly. Stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, I just wanted to check in. "How are you feeling these days? I know getting older can be challenging." I gave a small nod, my voice even. I manage. Thank you. She slipped out of her coat and settled into the chair across from me, her tone syrupy sweet. We were all saying how much we'd love to see you more often. The kids miss you. You should come around. I'll think about it, I said, folding my hands in my lap. There was a pause, the air tightening just slightly before she leaned forward. Her voice softened, but the words cut sharper. By the way, I heard you stopped by the bank last week. Everything okay? You know Daniel and I are always here if you need help managing things. I met her eyes without blinking, my own expression unreadable. I'm fine. Her smile faltered, then returned thinner, brittle around the edges. Look, Margaret, let's be honest. You can't handle everything on your own. And really, who else is there besides us? Daniel is your only real family. Don't make mistakes that could hurt him. I sat straighter, my gaze steady. Family is not built on demands and dismissal. I'd rather be alone than treated as a burden. Her chair scraped back sharply as she stood, color rising in her face. You've ruined this family with your pride. I rose too, moving calmly to the door. I opened it wide, my voice steady as stone. No, Olivia. I just stopped letting you ruin me. She glared for a beat longer, then swept past me into the night. I closed the door firmly behind her and turned the lock. The silence settled like a balm. Family is more than blood, I whispered to myself, my hand still resting on the cool brass of the lock. The folder from the bank sat on my kitchen table for 2 nights before I made the call. Richard Hale's number was still in my old address book, written in my husband's handwriting from years ago, when we first trusted him with our wills. My voice wavered only slightly as I asked his secretary for an appointment. She remembered me and offered a time that very afternoon. I hung up the phone and felt the air shift around me as if the house itself knew something irreversible was about to begin. The office building on Maple Avenue looked almost unchanged from the last time I had been there. The brass plaque beside the door still gleamed through the steps, showed cracks from winters past. Inside, the smell of polished wood and paper steadied me. The receptionist gave me a polite smile and led me down the hall to Richard's office. He stood as I entered, broader in the shoulders, his hair now mostly white, but his eyes the same calm gray that had reassured me 20 years ago. Margaret, he said warmly, it is good to see you. Please sit. I lowered myself into the leather chair across from him and set my purse on my lap. I need your help, Richard. His expression grew serious, his pen poised above a yellow pad. Go on. I drew a breath, the words sharp but clear. I want to create a trust. Everything I own, the house, the savings, the retirement accounts, all of it is to go to my granddaughter, Emily Grant. She is 24. She is the only one who sees me, the only one who has not asked me for money or treated me like I am in the way. Richard's pen scratched across the paper. That can be arranged. He paused and looked up, his tone careful. You understand, though, if you leave nothing to your son, he may contest it. Sometimes leaving a token amount discourages challenges. Even $1 is enough. My jaw tightened. I shook my head slowly, the words forming like iron in my chest. No. I want it airtight. I will not leave him a single cent. He has had enough, more than enough, and nothing has come back. This ends now. Richard studied me for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Very well. We can make it airtight. His pen moved again, faster this time, as he laid out the framework of the trust. He spoke about irrevocable clauses, successor trustees, protection from claims. I listened, my hands folded tightly in my lap, every word ringing like a lock snapping shut. He slid the first draft of documents across the desk for me to review. The language was dense, but I read each line, tracing the path of every dollar, every possession. Each clause transferred power away from David and toward Emily. Each signature space was a choice, and I made them without hesitation. When he passed me the pen, I steadied my hand and signed. The ink bled dark and permanent into the paper. My name stretched across the line strong, despite the tremor in my fingers. I did not look up until I was finished. Richard leaned back in his chair, tapping the papers into a neat stack. "You have taken a bold step today, Margaret. This is not easy, but it is clear. Emily will be protected." I stood my knees stiff, but my spine straight. That is what I want. No confusion, no loopholes. He escorted me to the door, his hand briefly touching my shoulder. "If anyone can weather this, it is you." Outside, the air smelled of snow and exhaust. I clutched the folder against my chest as I walked to my car, the wind cutting through my coat. The documents felt heavier than paper, like a shield I had forged for myself after years of being left defenseless. I slid into the driver's seat and set the folder on the passenger side. My reflection in the window looked older, yes, but steadier. The engine hummed to life, and I pulled onto the street. The buildings of Hartford blurred past as flakes of snow began to fall faint and scattered, catching in the headlights. For the first time in years, I felt the weight shifting. I was not just cutting ties. I was choosing where my legacy would rest. Emily's face came to mind, her kind eyes, her laughter. My hands tightened on the wheel. The future was no longer theirs to drain. It was mine to place where it belonged. I drove home in silence, the folder glowing faintly in the dim light beside me, every page inside a promise that I would not be erased. A week after leaving Richard's office, I slipped a letter into the mailbox with Emily's name written carefully across the front. I told her I wanted to see her, that there were things I needed to share face to face. I did not expect her to come so quickly, but 2 days later her car pulled into my driveway just as the late afternoon sun dipped behind the bare maples. I opened the door before she could knock. She stood there with her scarf loose around her neck, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Grandma," she said, and the sound of the word carried more warmth than my house had known in years. I pulled her into my arms, holding tight, breathing in the faint scent of her shampoo. For a moment, the weight on my chest eased. We went inside, and she dropped her bag by the door like she had when she was a child. I had already set out ingredients on the counter. The kitchen felt alive for the first time in ages. Together we chopped onion stirred broth and laughed when she spilled flour across the counter. I showed her how to crimp the edge of a pie crust, guiding her fingers with mine. She teased me about being a perfectionist, and I teased her back about her crooked smile. As the soup simmered, we set up the old chessboard on the dining table. The pieces were chipped, but Emily did not mind. She leaned her chin on her hand, studying the board with exaggerated seriousness. "You always beat me," she said. "Maybe tonight will be different." We played slowly, the conversation drifting between moves. She asked about my garden, and I asked about her job at the clinic. Her eyes shone when she talked about the patients she worked with, the long hours, the way it felt to make even a small difference. At one point, she set her night down and looked at me with sudden intensity. "You know, Grandma, I never thought of you as a burden. Never." The words hung in the air, soft but solid. My throat tightened, and I had to blink hard before I could move my pawn. "Thank you," I said, though it felt too small for the flood of relief her words brought. We ate dinner at the table, bowls, steaming pie cooling on the counter. Emily filled the room with her laughter, and I let myself believe for a moment that this was what family was meant to feel like. After we cleared the dishes, she leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting to something more serious. "Grandma, I need to tell you something." I felt my stomach dip, but I nodded for her to continue. She lowered her voice. "Dad and Samantha are in trouble. Financial trouble. They have been juggling credit cards and loans. I think that is why they pushed so hard for you to come to Chicago. It was not just about family." The room seemed to tilt slightly. I steadied myself by gripping the edge of the table. "Go on," I said. Emily's eyes flicked to mine, full of both worry and apology. They thought maybe you would help them out again. Maybe if you felt included, you would open your wallet. Her hands twisted together in her lap. I should not even know this, but I overheard them talking. I closed my eyes briefly, the weight of her words settling heavy. The airport scene, the photo, the empty chair that was never meant for me. It all sharpened into focus. So it had not been love or longing that prompted the invitation. It had been need, the kind measured in dollars. When I opened my eyes, Emily was watching me closely. I reached across the table and took her hand. "You do not have to apologize for them," I said. "None of this is on you." She squeezed back, her eyes shining. "I just wanted you to know the truth." We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint tick of the clock. The truth was bitter, but in that moment holding her hand, I felt steadier than I had in weeks. She was proof that not everything had been lost, that loyalty and love could still exist without conditions. Later, after she left for her hotel, I stood at the window watching her taillights disappear down the quiet street. The house was silent again, but it did not feel as empty. Her words echoed in my mind, both the warmth and the warning. I turned off the lights one by one, moving slowly through the rooms. In the kitchen, the chessboard still sat on the table, the pieces mid-game. I left it there, a reminder that she would come back, that not every connection had slipped away. Upstairs, I folded myself into bed, the blankets heavy around me. The air was cold, but my chest felt strangely warm. Emily's voice stayed with me as I drifted into sleep. "I never thought of you as a burden. It was enough to carry me through the night." 2 mornings after Emily drove back to Boston, I was folding laundry at the kitchen table when I heard a knock at the door. It was not the mailman's brisk tap or a neighbor's casual rap. It was deliberate 3 slow strikes that carried hesitation. When I opened the door, Samantha stood there. Her hair was perfectly smoothed back, her coat fitted too tightly for the chill, and a smile sat on her face like it had been practiced in the car mirror. "Margaret," she said softly, her voice threaded with a sweetness that did not reach her eyes. "May I come in?" I stepped aside without a word. She crossed the threshold, her lips clicking on the hardwood, and glanced around as though she were cataloging the state of her living room. I led her to the sofa. She waited until I sat before lowering herself into the chair across from me, arranging her purse carefully at her feet. "I know you are upset," she began, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "The whole thing with Thanksgiving was just a misunderstanding. David thought your flight was later. We would never have left you waiting on purpose." I watched her, my face calm. "Misunderstanding," I repeated the word, tasting sour. She nodded quickly, leaning forward. "Yes, that is all it was. The children missed you. We all did." My voice was quiet, but it cut through her rehearsed tone. "You did not come here to apologize, Samantha. You came to see if I am still useful." Her cheeks flushed, and she shifted in her seat. "That is not fair. It is true." For a moment she tried to hold the smile, but it faltered. Her hands twisted together, then stilled. "We want to make things right," she said carefully, but her eyes flicked toward the hallway like she expected David to appear and rescue her. I leaned back, folding my arms. Making things right would mean honesty. "Are you ready for that?" She swallowed hard. Then, with a sharpness that surprised even her, she asked, "So what happens to everything, the house, the accounts? You cannot expect us to be in the dark." Her mask had cracked, and what spilled out was not concern, but calculation. I let the silence stretch before I answered. "Everything has already been arranged." Her breath caught. "Arranged? Yes." Her lips parted as though she might argue, but she closed them again, her jaw tightening. She leaned back, crossing her arms now. "You mean to cut David out, do you? After all the years, after all he has done for you?" I met her gaze without blinking. "He has already received more than enough. You both have." The room felt heavier, then the air dense with all the things left unsaid. Samantha's eyes narrowed slightly. "This is not like you, Margaret." "No," I said evenly. "This is like me now." She stood abruptly, smoothing the front of her coat. Her purse strap dangled from her fingers. "Well, if that is how you feel, then I suppose there is nothing left to discuss." At the door, she paused, her hand on the knob. "David really is worried," she said, her tone clipped. "He should be," I replied. "Not because I am gone, but because I am not coming back to the place he thinks I belong." She hesitated a moment longer, then left. The door closed with a muted click that seemed to echo through the house. I stayed there for a while, sitting in the stillness she left behind. My hands rested calmly in my lap, my heart steady. The performance was over, and so was my part in it. After a time, I rose, returned to the kitchen, and finished folding the towels. The house was quiet, but for once the silence was mine. That evening, my phone rang again, and this time it was David's name on the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me wanted to hear his voice one last time. When I answered, all I heard at first was his uneven breathing. Then he spoke, his voice breaking. "Mom, how could you do this? I am still your son." The words struck me like a dull blade, not sharp enough to cut, but heavy enough to bruise. I closed my eyes and held the phone tighter. "Yes, David, you are my son. That will never change. But family is more than blood. Family is respect, care, and presence. You have not offered me those in years." He let out a sound that was half sob, half protest. "That is not true. We tried, we invited you, we thought you knew." I felt my jaw tighten. Inviting me at the last moment, leaving me at an airport, posting pictures of a full table without me. That is not family. That is performance. Silence crackled on the other end, broken only by the faint hum of static. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller, like a boy again. "I just do not understand. After everything, why cut us out? Because love without respect is not love. Because I will not spend the rest of my life begging for scraps of your attention. I have given enough, more than enough." He was crying now, the sound raw, unguarded. "You are still my mother," he said again, as if repeating it would make me fold. I let the words settle before I answered. "I am your mother, yes, but I am no longer part of the family you and Samantha have built. You closed that door long ago." There was a sharp intake of breath, then nothing. No excuses, no apologies, no explanations, just silence. I waited, giving him the chance to speak. He did not. For the first time in my life, I did not rush to fill the quiet. I said softly, almost gently, "David, one day you may understand. Tonight is not that day." He tried to say something, but the words tangled and fell apart. Then came the sound of him exhaling hard, defeated. I held the phone a moment longer, listening to the weight of his silence. Then I ended the call. The room around me was still the shadows stretching across the walls. My hands were steady, my heart heavy but certain. It was the first time I had spoken the truth without softening it, without leaving a back door open for excuses. I set the phone down on the table, folded my arms across my chest, and let the silence stay where it was. For once, it did not feel like punishment. It felt like clarity. The next morning, the light came through the blinds, soft and golden, carrying with it a sense of peace I had not felt in years. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with a pen and my thickest stationery. The trust papers Richard had prepared lay beside me. I slipped them into a large envelope and began a letter for Emily, the words flowing steady and sure. Emily, you once told me I was your safe place. You saw me when no one else did, not for what I gave or what I could provide, but for who I was. You are the only one who has ever looked at me without expectation or obligation. I want you to know that everything I own, every part of my life that can be secured, is now entrusted to you. This is not a burden. It is a gift. It is my way of saying that you mattered to me more than anything because you made me feel like I mattered too. I sealed the letter with the papers, tucking it into the envelope with a final press of my palm. The act felt ceremonial, like setting down a weight I had carried far too long. That weekend, Emily returned. She arrived by train, her face bright, despite the fatigue in her eyes. When she stepped off the platform and saw me waiting, she broke into a smile so genuine it nearly undid me. She hurried toward me, her arms open, and I embraced her tightly. At home, we settled in the house once again, filled with the sound of her laughter. She brewed coffee while I sliced fruit, and together we set the table in an easy rhythm. After breakfast, she pulled out her phone and said we should take a picture, just us. I hesitated for a moment, remembering the photo that had broken me at the airport, the one where there had been no seat left for me, but Emily's eyes were shining and I nodded. We stood by the old maple tree in the yard, its branches bare but strong against the winter sky. She set the phone on a timer and hurried back to my side. Her arm slipped around me, warm and certain, and the camera clicked. When we looked at the image afterward, my throat tightened. There we were, two faces side by side, no pretense, no performance, just love. It was only the two of us, but the happiness in that frame was fuller than any crowded table I had ever seen. Later, as we sat with mugs of tea, I let my thoughts find words. I told her I did not regret the decisions I had made, even if they hurt others. I told her I had finally drawn a boundary that was long overdue. She listened quietly, nodding, her hand resting lightly on mine. As evening fell, we placed the photo in a simple wooden frame and set it on the mantel above the fireplace. The glow from the flames touched the edges, giving it a warmth that filled the room. I looked at it and felt something inside me settle. I was not in their photo, the one they posted with their smiles and their empty caption. But I had created one of my own. This time, I was not the extra chair, not the forgotten call, not the silence waiting to be filled. This time, I was seen. And so I whisper to anyone listening, to anyone who has ever felt invisible at a table that should have been theirs, treasure the people who truly care, because they are the ones who give life its meaning. And remember, silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is the strongest form of revenge, the kind that frees you and makes you whole again. If this story touched you, share your thoughts. Tell me about the moments when you chose yourself, when you found the strength to draw your own line. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, let them know they are not alone. Your silence has power. Your place is your own, and you never need permission to keep it.